As we have just seen the release of Disney's live-action adaptation of Aladdin, whether you are excited by that idea or not, I think now is a great time to talk about some Aladdin from the past, and specifically as it was released on home consoles after the release of the original animated film. And I don't mean the game for the Sega Genesis, I'm talking about the game as released on the Super Nintendo. And I'll just start by saying, from my own personal experience, that between the two, I love, enjoy, and prefer the Super Nintendo game above the Genesis version. And I can almost hear the comment section now. Really? The SNES version? Why? The Genesis version is clearly better because Aladdin has a sword!
He's got a sword! Hey, you idiots! We've all got swords!
Well, my experience with it was still really positive and mostly enjoyable, and I hope to convince you through this video that this game, as released by Capcom, is worthy of you at least trying it to see if maybe you might enjoy it too. While the original animated film released in November of 1992, the Genesis game didn't release until November of 1993, followed by the SNES game by Capcom only 20 days later at the end of November that year. Pretty close competition between the two, but I can remember my 8th birthday just 2 months later at a birthday party inside a roller skating rink, cause I was incredibly cool like that, where I received my copy of the Capcom game and poured myself into understanding it and figuring it out. Now, I was not very good at platformers, wasn't then, still am not, especially now, but maybe it's because it was based on my favorite animated Disney film, I was so desperate to mastering it. And while initially I had to have my dad's help in beating a level or two, I did eventually beat it, and then I'd go back and play it again. And again, until I got so confident with it that I didn't need to hardly think about what I was doing at all. And maybe that's me being overly confident. After all, I've got to admit, this is not the hardest platformer that has ever been released. In fact, you can look at a couple of other Disney releases for some examples of really bizarrely difficult gameplay. Just get up. Why? But everything about the game just makes me happy. The animation is cute and lively, the recreations of Aladdin's soundtrack sounds amazing on a Super Nintendo, the original music to the game is fun and upbeat, and it's classic Capcom platforming at its finest, easy enough for beginners to the genre to understand. And aside from the platformers that Capcom was most famous for, this wasn't their first foray into Disney platforming either. Capcom had already made several Disney platformers before they ever got to Aladdin, several of which I think you guys may know, which have been significantly highly praised over the years. Some of which, sure, are much more difficult than others, but I think that resume alone should be enough for your typical Capcom platformer fan to give the Aladdin on SNES the chance it rightfully deserves. And as a quick reminder, let's not forget that this game was designed by Shinji Mikami, the same man who directed Resident Evil, Resident Evil 4, Dino Crisis, and God Hand. And while Aladdin is certainly no Resident Evil, I do think that this being one of Mikami's earliest works in Capcom gives the game a little more merit. The story from the movie is told in little mini cutscenes. The first cutscenes you get are before you even start the game from the title screen, showing how Jafar discovered the Cave of Wonders and telling the player that we need to find a diamond in the rough to walk in there and grab the mysterious magic lamp trapped on the inside. Start the game up and your journey as Aladdin begins, with your best friend Abu the monkey running by your side. He doesn't actually do anything or help you in any way. He's kind of just there as colorful and amusing set dressing. The Agrabah you're running through is bright and vivid, with lots of activity happening. Of course, you're being attacked by the city's royal guards, but they're easy enough to get past by stunning them with apples and knocking them off screen by bouncing on their heads Mario style. Some guards are archers and will try to shoot you down with arrows, causing a little bit more of a challenge. But later guards in the game will come at you with swords, even throwing them at you like a boomerang. There's these poor citizens of Agrabah sticking their heads out of their windows, just trying to have a nice view of the city when you suddenly come along and use their heads as a trampoline to get to higher platforms. But then the really weird enemies come in. Like, okay, I kinda understand the snakes in the jars, but I'm not 100% certain I understand the upside down jars with like bird feet walking around in the street. It gets weirder when those jars start to sprout wings and fly later. Don't rightly remember that from the film, but, you know, anything goes in a platformer, I guess. Agrabah and its connected areas are all covered in jewels, specifically what seem to be diamonds and rubies. Collect 100 jewels and you can add another heart container to your life. You start with 3 life containers and can raise up to 10 by the end of the game. There are only 10 rubies scattered throughout a specific set of zones, and mind you, they don't really do anything, they just give you bragging rights once you get to the password screen. Also, if you collect enough of them, the closing credits of the game will look just a little bit different than had you not tried to grab them at all. Because remember, gathering those rubies is the only way you're going to get to see this cute little English phrase, "You are great player." I feel like I need this on a t-shirt. There's a number of things you're going to want to collect throughout your gameplay aside from those jewels though. The very first thing that I think is absolutely the most critical is this sheet you can get from the very first stage. Once you have that, you'll always have it equipped for the remainder of the game, and sometimes if you lose all your lives and have to continue, you'll have to get it again from a handful of other chests scattered throughout the stages. But this sheet will allow you to glide with ease across much of the stage, which can almost feel like cheating sometimes, but it can't get you out of everything. Next, you're going to want to collect apples. They're a limited resource, but you can stack up to 99 of them in your apple inventory. In fact, most of the time I end up not even using them, but I do have to admit that they are a useful tool in some circumstances, where you might need to stun a guard or even kill a smaller oncoming enemy. If your health depletes, you'll have a couple of options. Finding a loaf of bread will refill 1 empty heart container, while finding a whole roast chicken will recover all of your hearts. Occasionally, you will find 1-ups scattered across the map, which should be plentiful enough to get you through the game pretty easily. And even more rare than any of these is the heart container item, which refills all of your empty heart containers and adds 1 additional heart container to your bar. Finally, you'll want to nab the scarab beetle from select chests on select stages. Grab it before it flies away and you'll be treated to a bonus stage with the genie, who will give you rewards such as refilling heart containers, adding a heart, giving extra lives, or giving you additional credits in case you lose all your lives and want to continue playing the game, as if you were in an arcade pumping in quarters. As you progress through the stages, you'll run into your first boss, the guy from the movie Selling Apples who tries to cut off Princess Jasmine's hand for not being able to pay for her food. He's not especially hard. Let him take a swing at you, jump on his head, do that 3 times and you're good. Moving forward and going into the Cave of Wonders stages might be some of my favorite in the game. The colors are more muted, it's damp and creepy with great atmospheric music. Which, by the way, now is as good a time as any to talk about this soundtrack. These original tracks are quite simply classic Capcom, as the game had a total of 3 composers, Setsuo Yamamoto, Yuko Takehara, and Yuki Iwai, who at the time was named Yuki Satomura. If none of these names seem very familiar to you, just remember that all 3 of them also worked on the absolutely bangin' soundtrack to the game Mega Man X, among their many other accomplishments. Anyway, the Cave of Wonders starts to introduce a few new enemies into the mix. You start to see bats, scorpions, and even some walking and jumping pairs of swords! Well, it's a cave full of magic, so who am I to judge? You have to start to worry about floating logs, collapsing floors, stalactites that break off from the ceiling. You'll be opening up pathways with slowly falling spikes and dodging giant crushing boulders before finally stumbling upon the lamp, which, and you all know how this goes, is exactly when Abu grabs an enormous jewel and brings the house down in a very, very bad way. The next set of stages involves trying to escape from the cave as it begins overflowing with lava. You've got a stage in which the camera is constantly scrolling, and getting left behind can get you killed, worsened by the literal "the floor is lava," and falling in it will quite obviously kill you. Platforms are constantly being propelled by erupting lava, and fireballs are being launched up into the air that you'll need to dodge. But what was even harder than this, especially when I got this as a kid, were the stages where you're riding on the magic carpet and trying to dodge falling rocks and waves of lava in an attempt to escape the cave. And mind you, now I'm old enough to understand that the whole thing is a pattern, and once you have played it enough times and know what the pattern is, it's not exactly a hard set of stages. But I remember as a kid, this was easily the most difficult part of the entire game. My dad saw how much it frustrated me, and he ended up having to beat it for me and giving me the password to continue past it. It's kind of frustrating and embarrassing to admit that, but hey, as a 33-year-old in the year 2019, at least I can say with all confidence that this is absolutely no longer a problem anymore. You'll end up stuck in the cave, of course, but at least you've got the lamp. The game suggests that the genie invites you inside his lamp, which isn't exactly how the movie portrays the whole friend like me moment, but hey, it's a good enough excuse to get some wacky antics. Now these stages are fun. Bright, vivid, colorful. Friend like me is playing in the background, and there's just a ton of crazy genie antics happening all around you. There's platforms with the genie's face plastered all over them, and his face actually reacts when you jump on them or hang off of them. The genie will fly in and give you cloud platforms to jump across. You'll ride his tongue upwards into the sky. His face is on a bunch of balloons that you can use to either swing across or jump off the tops of, popping them in the process. Also, why are there tornadoes in here? I mean, not that riding the genie's tongue makes a whole lot of sense. That's what she said. But maybe these tornadoes are the most out of place. Whatever, you get out of there and fly off on the carpet, but the story then tells you that Abu falls off the carpet and ends up in one of the ancient pyramids of Egypt. And then you gotta go in there and rescue him? Sure, because we all remember that part of the movie, right? The part where you have to run through rivers of sand with bats made out of sand flying at you from all directions, spiky traps chomping at you, and why are there palace guards down here? How long have they been waiting to defend whatever is even down here? Whatever, the stage is creative enough and you'll get your friend back. Ultimately, you get out of there and the genie turns you into a prince. You get one really chill stage where the entire point is to take Jasmine on a magic carpet date and collect jewels. That's it. That's the stage, and it's just a cute excuse to listen to a Super Nintendo version of A Whole New World. But after this is where we start to get into the endgame. Jafar tries to become the Sultan and kicks Aladdin out of Agrabah. You play stages where you have to bust back into the palace, save Jasmine and the genie, and stop Jafar from being an all-around jerk. The palace is grim and full of guards. Iago shows up a few times throwing bouncing skulls at you, and the implication that Iago just has a bunch of skulls lying around is a little bit horrifying. Guards are throwing swords at you, swords are throwing themselves at you, you can start dropping fire on people, the stage starts trying to light you on fire, there's pits filled with spikes, there's platforms that can be triggered to take alternate paths, all the stops have been pulled out here, and then finally you meet him, Jafar. And this mofo can fly! He's throwing his cobra staff at you, which will send electric shocks across the screen that you gotta dodge. Thankfully, you can use that staff to launch yourself up into the air and jump on Jafar's head. This doesn't make him happy though, as he'll throw bolts of lightning at you when you do. Thankfully, they're super easy to avoid. Just go chill out on the edge of the screen, nothing to worry about. It's a little more difficult when he starts filling the screen with those bouncing, flying barrel bird things. I mean, again, the good news is that you can use those enemies to bounce on Jafar's head, but it still gets a little cluttered. Once you've knocked Jafar around enough times, however, it's time to move on to the final stage. And you know they had to give you Giant Cobra Jafar as your final boss. If I have to be honest with you, as far as platforming bosses are concerned, he's not especially difficult. But he is kind of weird. For one, he's immune to apples, so don't even bother throwing them at him. But what's most bizarre is that he spits something from his mouth. What are those? Balls? Eggs? Whatever they are, they bounce, and you'll want to use them to once again keep jumping on Jafar's head. He'll also occasionally come down to your level and attempt to take a bite at your ankles. There's also a really cool effect that happens here, but if I have to be honest with you, I'm not entirely sure whether or not it's intentional. Every time you jump up into the air off of those bouncing things that come out of Jafar's mouth in an attempt to reach his head, the game goes kinda slow-mo, a la the $6 Million Man. And yeah, it looks cool, but when it gets that sluggish, it almost feels like every individual moving piece of animation on the screen all at once are probably what's slowing this boss fight down. After all, Snake Jafar is a very segmented enemy to give the effect of this worming snake body. Add in even a few more moving parts when he starts spitting eggs, and it's no wonder Aladdin has suddenly gone bionic. But once you've hit him enough times, you win, and you just watch the end of the story play out before you, followed by the credits rolling with the Super Nintendo cover of the pop cover of A Whole New World playing in the background. You are a great player. Given how much I love this game, I've always felt it was a shame that fewer people seemed to enjoy it or even remember it over its Genesis brother. It was somewhat exciting then to hear that it was getting re-released on the Game Boy Advance back in 2003. But from everything I've ever heard about it, this port is simply disappointing at best and should probably be avoided at all costs. For one thing, that soundtrack sounds absolutely atrocious on the GBA's sound chip. The 2 songs from the movie that were originally in the game, Friend Like Me and A Whole New World, were both scrapped for this release and replaced with whatever music this is. There's no passwords in this game, so it seems like you have to beat it in one sitting or not at all. You can now sometimes win additional mini-games from the genie when you catch the golden scarab, where you can collect more jewels and items. But the worst change of all has to be the no inclusion of "You are a great player." Sad. Just sad. Aladdin for the Super NES definitely is not the most difficult platformer of all time. Those of you more familiar with other classic platforming of the NES and SNES era who enjoy the likes of Mega Man or Castlevania might not find Aladdin to be much of a challenge. That having been said, if you're not a huge fan of platforming, this might be a nice, cozy game for you to try your hand at, especially if you're a fan of the original Disney animated feature. It's a vivid experience in visuals and audio with tight and accurate controls, all from a core Capcom team that you know and love from a slew of other amazing classic Capcom titles. Aside from being a little easy, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this game. What's most important about it is that it's fun, and it's a nostalgic joy for me every time I sit down to play it. I smile every single time I fire it up, and during this time where our attentions are being turned back to Aladdin, I can only hope that maybe some of you would like to give this game a chance in the future too. You are great player.